Okay, I'd like to start off by asking those of you who are on Zoom, remember to send me an email through Canvas reminding me that you participated today on Zoom. With that, let's get it started. Let's get it started. Ooh, just saying. So today we'll talk about the Romanesque and the Gothic periods. And one of the characteristics of this era at this time, at this place, is that virtually all of the artwork is connected to the church. Period. It's the power, it's the authority, it is the governing body of Europe for many decades. We talked about the Holy Roman Empire. This is it. And so what we'll see here is kind of a continuous development, first called Romanesque and then Gothic. And so I believe we were right around here last time in showing you that one of the major developments from these various kinds of chapels that were built during the Middle Ages and the Romanesque period, they become a lot more standardized. There's a continuous evolution of the architecture for about 300, 400, maybe even 500 years. But this is a big development. That is, the building itself is in the shape of a cross, and we have this ambulatory area behind the altar, and in this area, you see up here and around here, that's how you would walk and pray through here. Ambulatory means walking. Amble on over. Ambulatory, it's a pathway. And so these are chapels on the perimeter. And so anyway, this is a plan of St. Sernin, and it's late 11th, early 12th century. And so we've seen a number of these things here. St. Foy, St. Faith in English, looking southeast. And you see, we'd start to see spires appear. But I want you to pay attention to this as well. This is the roof line. That's the roof line. That's this. It's in the shape of a cross, very deliberate, symbolic. And another thing I want you to note is that the architecture's getting higher, or the ability to build higher increases as the technology, the mathematics and everything increase. And so going higher. And the other part is that the outside, the exterior, typically has little ornamentation. And you can see here, you can almost, so plain, you can almost count the bricks in the photograph here. And so this is what the status was in Europe with cathedrals at this time. And so interior, St. James, Santiago de Compostela, Spain. And they're going higher. This is how they roll. This is what's happening here. And I want to kind of point out something here too. There's very little on these walls. in terms of frescoes, in terms of painting, in terms of low relief. It's basically bare. Now, when you get close, when you're in the apse, APSE, and that's where the altar is, and that's where you have the ambulatory that goes around the back of this, you see much more ornamentation. And I got to add this too. These seats here, this is a tradition that starts to arise in these cathedrals, and that is that honored guests, the royalty, the clergy not participating in the mass, just in attendance. These are like, this is like having what you would call, what do they call those at the Cardinals game, where you get reserved seats up on the second level. You get all of this, everything you can eat and drink. Forgot what they call those. It's a special thing, but we still do that. Sports, you show the camera in a football game, they'll show you, they'll pan around and you'll see the ownership of the teams and stuff. This is kind of something that's just really part of the culture, and it comes out of this. And I might add that in Europe, the culture was this. There's this is just the way things are. And so St. Cyrian, looking east, again, I'll point out, these are typically folding chairs, because as its original design, as I say many times, didn't include seats. People stood, if they had to kneel for mass, they knelt on the floor. Being seated was not in the service. And so anyway, and these are electric lights, replaced chandeliers, but you can see this is how pretty much how it was lit. And again, I'll zoom in on the apse, and this is where you'll find the ornamentation, the paintings, the sculpture at the altar inside this. And also you'll see this is where the windows are, and the light is coming through there. That's an important part to remember, and I'll show you why here in a minute. And so again, excuse me, what's the roof line on this? This is a cutaway version, to be sure, but this is one way, this is the other. This weren't cut away, you'd see that roof line go all the way to here. It's in the shape of a crucifix. It's how they did it. And something else they started to do is, as I was saying a moment ago, they wanted to go higher. That was the plan. That's what they strove for. That was their ambition. And so what they have here, you can see, it's almost like three buildings, one on top of the other, a narrow one, a wider one, and then finally the base. You can see that. And you can see that inside this, it's supported by columns, and the way that this is put together, it allows for the weight to be distributed out. In fact, these are in some ways enclosed buttresses. They actually buttress the whole building. Buttresses allow a wider distribution of the weight, and it allows the cathedrals to go up. And so what we start to see at this time too is that some of the artists involved in making the statues, the sculptures, the relief work, and eventually frescoes, we'll start to get to know their names. As a rule, that wasn't part of the identification of a work. We see a lot of those Byzantine Madonnas, Byzantine Christ, all of these other reliefs about biblical themes. Bottom line, we never know who did them. And it's in part, has to do with this caste system, if you will. It was the system of governance. It was the social order in Europe at this time. I want to go back a little bit, remind you that through what they call the Dark Ages, from about 550 to 850 Common Era, Europe was besieged by the Vikings. And all they had were these little settlements that are, in some cases nowadays, large cities, but they had settlements along the rivers, which was also their fresh water source. And as that started to change, as the Vikings were being driven out, the Europeans organized, they were able to defend themselves against such attackers. And as they organized a social system. And that consisted of the Pope in Rome being the supreme authority. And then right under that was the Holy Roman Emperor. That was Charlemagne, was the first Holy Roman Emperor, and I believe he was ordained or installed, I should say, in like 813 Common Era. And so around this, they built another social order. And so under Charlemagne, or the emperor, there would be what they call feudal lords. And they would have different names like earls, dukes, count, duke and duchess, count and countess, so on. They would have a set of royalty that was under the Holy Roman Emperor and above everybody else in their you would call those how should I say this? In their area, in their geographical area. They also had their own names for these, like let me go back on the screen, I'll show you. Okay, they would have kingdoms, and these would be kingdoms, but they would have a duchy, D-U-C-H-Y, which would be governed by a duke. And so all of these places would have a king, Holy Roman Empire, Emperor, Pope in Rome. And that's not too different from what was going on in the rest of the world. And so underneath the Duke and the Duchess would be the skilled people. And that would include clergy, that would include other people that would be in charge of the agriculture, and they would have these ministers and so on. And then under that would be artists, and finally peons at the bottom. So you see, the artists weren't very high on the social order. And in fact, a lot of the clergy, a lot of the royalty kind of considered the artist to be just another worker, maybe a little more skilled than most, but the idea of attributing the artist, giving artists what we would call credit for the work, that didn't happen. But Bernardus Gildunius, hard to say, we know he made this. And that's another change in how things are happening. Not all artists are recognized. We can't attribute everything to a particular artist, but we're starting to be able to do that. And I'd like to point out yet another issue, and that is that this is Christ in majesty, Christ seated on a throne. And how do we know it's Christ? Well, a few indicators. The Holy Book, the sign of peace, the halo with the cross in it. And you can see in this case, I can zoom in on this, unbearded, as I said before. These things kind of go back and forth, whether Christ was old and wise or he was a young man that died before his time. And so here is from mostly a contemporary. We don't know who did this, but this is a lintel. We've been talking about lintels for a long time too in architecture. That's the cross member that goes between two posts. Post and lintel architecture, they're still using that. Use it as doorways, but oftentimes they put a post in the middle of the lintel and have two doorways. I'll show you that in a second. And so we have Christ, the blessing, the book, the halo, the beard, enthroned. And so we're kind of getting, even though the depictions are somewhat different, we see two things happening. One is that instead of being particularly extremely natural, it's more important to get the iconography right. And so this looks a little bit more in proportion, say, than this. This is, the head's like way too big. If you were to turn in something like this in figure drawing, they would tell you you needed more practice. But at any rate, but the message is truly the most important part. And again, the iconography, the winged angels with halos, and so on. Christ, doubting Thomas and his apostles, and it's a pier relief in the cloister of the Abbey Church. I want to tell you a little bit about that. I think we talked about it already, about how the monasteries were those places away from those villages where the clergy set up. They built monasteries. They lived in the monasteries. They were self-sufficient. Inside the monastery, typically agriculture, livestock, they grew their own food, and they had a chapel, and they would have what you would call dormitories. They would have places for the residents at the monastery to live. But as we move forward in time, and you know that the Duke and Duchess have to commit that one of their sons and one of their daughters devote themselves to a lifetime of service to the church. That could be, they would be a bishop or a cardinal, could mean that they were a nun, could mean that they were a monk in a monastery. But at any rate, as Europe became more prosperous, as this class of royalty arose, not only did they send their children in service of the church, they also sent money. And so these monasteries, these abbeys, if you will, become much more elaborate, and they start receiving some of the treatment that we see go up in cathedrals. There's a section of the book that talks about abbeys and the role of the chapel and stuff, and how that fits into the rise of the Gothic. Take a look at it. But anyway, the story here is kind of clear. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not counting Christ. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We know there were 12 disciples. We know Judas hung himself, but they replaced him, and I forgot with whom. Anybody well versed in that? At any rate, they picked up another disciple along the way, and these 11 out here were gathered when Christ appeared before them. And they were stunned, to say the least. They thought Jesus had been dead. He was killed on the cross. On the third day, he rose again, according to the scriptures. That's part of the Nicene Creed, by the way. Got to believe that if you're Christian. Second is that there was an apostle that did not attend. He was gone. We don't know his whereabouts, but we know he was not there when Christ came back and appeared before his apostles. And when they told Thomas, the absent apostle, about what happened, he said, I don't believe you. You guys are crazy. And I'm not going to believe he's back unless I get to stick my fingers in his wounds. Whoa, that's pretty tough. And so anyway, Christ stays around. Thomas does see Jesus. And that's the idea of putting his fingers in the wound, the stab wound from the Roman soldier from when he was dying on the cross. That's what this is about. And we used to use a lot of phrases just in general conversation. You ever hear the term doubting Thomas? That's what this means. Oh, you're just a doubting Thomas. Well, this is him, doubting Thomas. And so, and that's what this represents. And so anyway, and here is a historiated capital, the cloister of St. Pierre. This is in the monastery. And what they mean by historiated capital is that they're not using those ancient Greek, Roman orders of capitals, which would be Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. They fashioned their own, and it typically had something to do with the liturgy, with the Bible. It would depict a story or a theme from the religion itself. And so, but what I want to point out is that these abbeys went from these little tiny things where people were deaf, personally, they were deprived. These monasteries they, as I could use another term, they had lived Spartan lives, existence. They were not interested in any kind of amenities, any kind of self-satisfaction, and typically prayed, put together manuscripts, worked in the fields. Sometimes they wouldn't even speak. They would, it was its own kind of existence, a contemplative life, if you will. But as we move forward to the 12th century, those monasteries are really becoming the place where a lot of effort, a lot of artwork is directed. And so here is an abbot, a guy who runs a monastery, the abbey, if you will. And he's got something in his hand here that I really want to talk about. The shepherd's crock, or shepherd's hook, as you might know it. And what that is a depiction of this abbot, and he's got this shepherd's crock. And what that crock is, for a shepherd, it's a way to help control the sheep. Sheep are notorious for not sticking together in the herd. And if you are a shepherd, you have sheep, you don't want these sheep running out all over the place. They get lost, wolves get them, kill them, eat them, stuff. So there's a parable in the New Testament where Christ talks about the good shepherd, and he leaves his flock behind to go find that one stray. So we got this idea of Christ as the good shepherd. It's based on actual shepherding, and that's why he has this shepherd's crock. And so the crock itself, or a shepherd, would be used to either, sometimes had a big hook, you could hook the strays and bring them back, or you could poke them and push them in the right direction. Typically, shepherds had dogs, herding dogs. Dogs bred for the job of herding sheep. And so they still appear in dog names, like a German shepherd, for example. Australian shepherd, blue heeler, etc. And so another point, Notre Dame. Notre, out of the Latin, about well-known, famous, notorious, notoriety, all come from this same word. Dame, woman. Most esteemed woman, the Virgin Mary. You'll find all over France, they name their churches, cathedrals, monasteries after the Notre Dame. So don't get confused. If they're naming their places, naming their buildings and monasteries and cathedrals after the Virgin Mary, but it's not all the same place. And so anyway, here we are, 12th century, again, taking a look at this, the interior of this abbey church. They were saying, abbeys become much, much more elaborate, more buildings, more large buildings, more artwork, and so on. And so anyway, but you don't see the adornment here, period. It's all very austere. It's very stark. And if I could remind you of what was going on in the Islamic world inside of mosque, and we were able to see a few interiors of mosque at the time. They were adorned from bottom to top and side to side, the mosaics, the tile work, the gold leaf, the patterning, the scripture, all. And this looked like a, well, I'm not going to be sacrilegious. Yeah, I will. Looks like a garage or something, you know, it's, by comparison. And it's not that they couldn't, it's just that their priorities were a little different. So that starts to change. And we see here a kind of an early attempt in the early 12th century to adorn, at least adorn the outsides of these buildings. And what they do typically is they have low relief that in a lot of ways will resemble ancient friezes, if you will. And you have here all of the people, and they are attendants of some sort. One's got a cup, one's looks like he's playing a musical instrument, so on and so on. But here in the center, larger than anything else, is Christ. And on either side, angels and other figures. But around the perimeter, this is called a tympanum, by the way, this semicircular place above the doorway. This is all pattern. And it looks as though much of it is based on a floral motif, not unlike what we were seeing in the mosque of the era. And this is all low relief carved in stone. Here's some more floral based design, circular to be sure, but these radiate like petals on a flower. And so it's a kind of, there's a, how should I say this? Let me tell you, there's a couple of adjectives we use when describing patterning, and two of them are geometric, which is based on mathematical principles and geometry. And the second patterning is what you would call biomorphic, life forms. So that's when you find flowers or leaves or other kinds of life making up the segments of the pattern. And so that's that. And here is, that's the lintel, and here's that center post. Portal, that's what they use to call the entryway. And you can see the whole entryway is adorned somehow. And here it is, Romanesque church portal, lintel, tramo, which is that center post, tympanum. And on the side, door jambs, we still use that term a lot today. And so they start to evolve. They become much more elaborate, much more adorned. And Notre Dame La Grande, again, Notre Dame comes up a lot. And we see the archways, and in some cases, these are like faux archways and faux columns. What I mean is artificial, faux, fake. It's there just for decoration purposes only. And so, and what we would have up here in the center, stained glass. But for the most part, and we start to see these spires emerge too. I got to mention that. But for the most part, you don't see a lot of windows and stuff. You got this big one I showed you here. This is at the end where you'd have in the apse, this is where you'd have the stained glass. This is where you'd have the windows, but on the side, see, they had put electric lights in these places because there was no other light coming in. And it was okay to have light come into the altar, but the idea of lighting up the entire building with sunlight through stained glass didn't happen, not in Romanesque times. And so here's another portal, central portal on the west facade, St. Trophime, Arles, France. Anybody know anything more about Arles? ARLES. Where Van Gogh was, and he painted a lot of paintings from Arles, south. Anyway, here we is, the lintel, the tympanum, what do we call that thing? The trameau in the center, two big doors. These doors were, as a rule, typically very heavy, very fortified. They were strong. And in a lot of ways, and I guess it still had everything to do with the Viking invasions and the other people that came and invaded these areas of Europe, that these are beautiful churches, but there's no way to get in here. If you wanted to have your population protect them from the Viking hordes, you could lock the women and children up in here. That's place of refuge. Actually, that was a practice that persisted in early America too. Put the women and children, lock them up in a church for their safety while the Revolutionary War was going on, or the Civil War, or whatever. And so, still 12th century again. And as I was saying, we don't know who the artists were for the most part. And this is Old Testament prophet Jeremiah or Isaiah in a question mark. And so what I would like to point out is that except for a few prophets, there was no real iconography ever developed. We have the iconography of Isaac. He's got a knife in his hand. He's got a little boy he's ready to kill. We know that's Isaac. And we know Jonah and the whale. See a whale, see a guy in a boat, stuff like that. But bottom line, Adam and Eve, we know who they are, but most of the time, we're still guessing as to who's being depicted here. And so, Gilbertus, another sculptor, actually has quite a legacy. I want to zoom in on this guy here a little bit too. And so we know this is Christ, has the cross, halo, and we're starting to see something that really in a lot of ways comes out of the Islamic world too, that you start to put words on the wall. They become part of the piece. And so that's really kind of a new development. And you can pretty much know, and I want to say this because it is important, although there were crusades organized usually by the Pope with the Holy Roman Emperor, and then maybe some other lower people on the pecking order, organized to put together an army and go attack the Middle East and reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity. I know two famous ones. One of them was an English king named Richard the Lion-Hearted. Another one was King Louis IX. And so other than, there's some question about how many crusades there were, but aside from those crusades, most everything between those wars kind of went back to normal. And there was an interaction between the West and the East. And we know that to be true. We saw in chapter 11, the Islamic world, at the end of that chapter, we saw baptistries being made in the Middle East for European churches, for European Christian churches. We see the canteen with depictions of the events in the life of Christ, made in the Middle East for someone in the West. And in the video we saw from Khan Academy about the Islamic world, it talked about how one of the sultans from the Middle East sent a gift to Charlemagne, and it was a water clock. And the narrator said Charlemagne got this thing, was really kind of high tech for the age. And if it's a water clock, it may have been inspired by the Chinese, who were really good at that sort of thing. At any rate, Charlemagne didn't know what it was. Thought it might have been some evil magic or something. So anyway, there was a lot of exchange despite the political and religious differences. This is the tympanum of the central portal of Le Madeleine. And oftentimes, as this goes, you'll see two themes, but one of them, and you see this a lot, is the last judgment, where Christ presides at the end of the world in his second coming, and he will decide who is cast into hell or who joins him in heaven. And so that's really, that's a theme that carries on. This is not something you see quite so much in Byzantine art, but in this period of time, this becomes a major theme. And so anyway, this is Pentecost and the mission of the apostles. And so you guys know what Pentecost was? And see that idea of the last judgment, that has more to do with what's going on down here. But this is got a lot of symbolism in it. Pentecost was a gathering of the disciples, and the Holy Spirit descended upon them and they began speaking in tongues. That's right out of the New Testament. And so anyway, and as I was saying about this conflict, this constant battling back and forth taking place as crusades, in some cases, the Crusaders stayed in the Middle East, and that's what this is. This is a fortress built by Crusaders, and it existed there. Well, it's still here today, but this is where they stayed. It was like an outpost. You can see the Roman architecture, and you can know that that they maintained a presence, and they weren't always at war. So in some ways, this kind of interaction could have helped facilitate some of that trade that I was talking about a moment ago. Jesselbertus, we saw some of his sculpture already. Suicide of Judas. Judas, the one that betrayed Christ, had second thoughts when they saw what the Romans were going to do to Christ, and said, here, you can have your money back, let him go. And they said, nope, too late, Judas. Felt bad, went and hung himself. And so anyway, you can see that that's what's being depicted here. It's pretty gruesome. And we got demons here. Bad angels. Gisselbertus, again, we talk about Adam and Eve. Strategically located this plant for modesty purposes. And again, this isn't like the first, like the one we saw last week. The earliest nudity that comes back into this. This will change in due course, but that was an issue. And so illustrated manuscripts, still a primary source of art. We looked at some abbeys, we looked at some cathedrals, and what we have are monasteries producing what you would call codex, which actually is another word for a book. And so the Corby Gospels, Night Fighting Dragons. And so here is this, like I was saying, there was a whole other social system. And part of that social system was knights. This was the age of knighthood, as well as dukes and duchesses and lords and ladies and knights. Knights in white satin. Oh, sorry, my age comes through. Bottom line is that this is kind of an interesting thing, because we got knights slaying dragons, and that's not different from what we saw in this case some 700-800 years prior with, we looked at St. George and St. Theodorus, both warrior saints. And so these aristocrats were kind of comparing themselves to that and slaying dragons along the way. And so, yeah, they often cast themselves as historical figures, whether it was like the gospel writers, where it was like saints, St. Mark, Folio, or St. Mark writing the gospels. They saw themselves in that tradition. They saw some of their own knights as heroes slaying dragons. And so kind of what I want to say, these are Romanesque cathedrals, stained glass at the end. Typically in that apse would be the artwork you would find, but like I've been saying, most of the artwork is not present. There's some on the ceiling, it's starting to change. And this is another piece here too, and it's from the second half of the 12th century for late 1100s. And we got the Madonna enthroned, and with the Christ child, the arms are broken off, so we don't really know if he's holding the book or giving blessing or the sign of peace. But I thought what was noteworthy about this, and that is the Christ child. It's always been an issue with the iconography. Is he a boy? Is he a baby? Or is he the all-knowing Jesus, knowing what he was here to do and knowing his faith? And so to depict him as a baby in some cases as a baby with an adult's head, and in this case, a little boy with an adult's head. But Spire Cathedral, starting to see this arise, and a few more windows. but still, we see some of the decoration here, some of the frescoes, some of the biblical scenes around the corner. So it's sort of 1105. So we're right on up on the Gothic. And Hildegard reveals her visions. This is a Hildegard of Bingen. This is kind of an interesting manuscript illustration because Hildegard was a very saintly woman in Germany at the turn of the millennium. And she had visions and she wrote about her visions and wrote prayers. And this, anybody Catholic know what this would be? A confessional? See, she's revealing her visions and the priest here is hearing the confessions. And so we would have coronations of royalty and baptism of Christ, baptismal font, Notre Dame de Fonts Ligier, Belgium. Yeah, Belgium, excuse me. And again, they're starting to get, this is 1118, so they're regaining a lot of their skills that had been lost for 500-600 years. They're really starting to build buildings and build great buildings. They're starting to do sculpture. They're starting to do bronze casting, painting. We see a reemergence of, and head reliquary, excuse me, of Saint Alexander. We talked about relics too, kept in a reliquary, kept inside a church. And so there are a couple of other slides here to finish out this chapter. And so this is the Pisa Cathedral, the baptistry, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This is all, as you see, right, connected in this complex. And it kind of has a parallel track when we talk about Romanesque architecture. Northern Europe will go Gothic, and we'll talk about Gothic in Italy, the chapter after next, because they'll take two different kinds of approaches. And there's that Leaning Tower of Pisa. This is the baptistry. What I want to point out with Italian architecture of the period is that they really kind of buy into the idea of mathematics and geometry. So you see, this is not as adorned as some of the cathedrals up north, and there's a few sculptures, and the baptistry doors are famous here. But the idea of symmetry, the idea of proportion, the idea of geometry, really, to these guys, much more important in their architecture. And you can see that here too. 1, 2, 3, the middle one, 4, 5, symmetry. Both of these are the same. This and this, I think, are the same, but there's something going on here. But symmetry, geometrical design, and so on. And so, last of the Romanesque, we start to see the spires. We start to see a lot of things. A few more windows open up, but, you know, not really a lot of decoration, not a lot of, and again here, same thing. We see a lot of elaborate architecture. Don't see any ceiling paintings on the wall. No windows except for in the apse area. And so this is the plan. This is kind of what replaces it. We don't have the floor plan that resembles a crucifix. We have a single quadrant arch. I want to talk about that. This is buttressing, as I talked about. And these are all different versions of Romanesque architecture, but I really want to get to this today too. I hope you got any questions about the Romanesque period. Anyone? I think I goofed myself up here. There it is. And so, did I lose? Slideshow from the beginning. And now we got this back. Make sure I still have my people at home. Looks like it. Very good. And so, I want to show you about, actually the map hasn't really changed much. We got this Holy Roman Empire. We got France. We got Spain, still divided between Christian and Muslim kingdoms. Kingdom of France, etc. Bottom line, this is the feudal Gothic era in Europe. And we talk about the Gothic, and this began in 1135, which is right directly continuing what we just saw in Romanesque architecture. But this is seen as the first Gothic cathedral. It launches an era beginning in the mid-12th century and going for 150, 200 years. And so what we see out here is a little bit more decoration. It's kind of tough to see this. But I want to play you this video, and it's about what changes occurred from that Romanesque, which I saw things were kind of different from place to place, but generally they get better at building, they get better at building higher, they start to adorn their cathedrals, a little on the inside, a little on the outside, kind of uneven, but building up. And this changes everything. This is in Paris, modern day Paris, and Abbot Suger. I'm going to play it and let you guys hear it, and I have a few comments afterwards. Anybody know some good jokes? I got one. Why was the skeleton all by himself? Because he's got no body. Just say, my granddaughter. And so make sure I got the right share. This is what I want. Share it. Play it.
Here we are at the Basilica of Saint Denis,
the birthplace.
Thanks to Suger, who was the abbot in the first half of the 12th century. This church is incredibly important because it's the burial place of the royal families, and Suger himself is also an advisor to the royal family.
Was standing pouring in the windows.
So the choir is the space behind the altar of the church, and the ambulatory is the aisle that would take one behind the altar.
Actually, it's taking us around behind the altar.
Now, Suger completed completed the ambulatory and also the facade of the church.
And none of this was new construction. There had been a 9th century church here, and Sujet felt that it was inadequate as the burial place of the kings. At this historical moment, the kings of France
I'm gonna back this up a little bit because I want to show you something. See these? Those are sarcophagi. Those are tombs. That's where these royal people are buried, actually.
historical moment, the kings of France only really as the area immediately around Paris. But this was a time when the power was expanded. Sujet really wanted to create a style that expressed the growing power of the monarch. Now,
Oh,
in the
that's
history
something
of
else
the
too.
West,
I want to show you this. There's just so much in here. Fleur de lis. What's on the St. Louis flag? This, just saying.
express the growing power of the monarch. Now, in the history of Western church architecture, the way this would generally work is you would have an emblem at the back of the altar, and that would allow pilgrims to stop at small waiting chapels, these small rooms that would contain relics.
In the past, during the MS period, these chapels were separate rooms with walls around them. And Sujet's idea was instead to open up the space and to allow light to flood in. And that's exactly how this looks. It must have looked so different than anything I've seen before.
Instead of this looking like walls that are pierced by windows and relatively small windows, instead he's figured out how to engineer this structure in stone so that the walls can basically disappear and be replaced by glass, colored glass that lets this brilliant luminous color into the space. So let's talk about two things: how he did this, and second of all, why he did this.
Which one should we do?
Well, let's talk about how he did it. When you look at this, there's this complex web of interlocking pointed bolts.
Pointed arches are really key here because the one thing you can cover spaces of different shapes and sizes. Perhaps most importantly, a pointed arch doesn't push so much out as it does down. And because of that, the architect thick walls.
A traditional Roman placed on quite heavy walls because it does push outward. It splays with the weight. It tends to take the weight of the vaulting and push it straight down so that the weight doesn't have to be pushed from the side.
Looking up at those ribs, we have a sense of a pull toward the vertical. And all of these ribs thin columns. So there's a real sense of elegance and openness.
So radically different from the romance that came before, so solid, and where your eyes drawn around that rounded arch back down, and you felt the sense of gravity, you felt the sort of rootedness within romance that was so different. The church itself, any to a more heavenly place, to a more spiritual place. Sujet
thought he was reading the writing of Saint Louis, of the patron saint of this church.
instead, he was reading philosopher from the 6th century.
That writing was by Saint Louis, talked about how light was connected to the divine. So what Sujet wanted was to open up those walls and allowing the light that would allow a type of thinking on the part of the listeners where they would move from the contemplation of light to God.
This was a radical notion and actually flew in the face of other theological theories of the time. Ideas that are being established by St. Bernard, saying we have to get rid of all of it. Distract us. So saying, no.
That the visual is not a distraction, but a way of transporting us to the divine.
I have to say that I think Suje was incredibly successful. This is startlingly beautiful. I feel transported.
Okay. Let me see. Get my screen share. Open it up. And so I wanted to just say a couple of things about that. First of all, is that Saint Denis himself was really he was huge. He was the patron saint of France until the early 20th century when they changed patron saints. But I want to tell you his story. And this is Saint Denis, excuse me. The guy had lost his head. What? Here's another picture of him with a couple of angels. And you see over here, a couple of other guys that lost their heads too. Well, Saint Denis was an early Christian in France, in Paris, when the Romans had occupied France and Christianity was outlawed. And so what the Romans did in Rome would throw the Christians into the Colosseum and let them be eaten by lions or something. In France, if they found Christians and they wouldn't recant their faith, they were beheaded, executed. And so Denis was somebody who was executed. He was considered to be the Archbishop of Paris, the leader of the Catholics. And so he and his followers, that's what this is going on. But rather than just die right there, what happened with Denis was that he picked his head up and he walked away, head in hand, just like this. This is his thing. This one, he's got his eyes closed. This one, he's actually kind of looking where he's going a little more. But that's what he did. And he walked and walked and walked. He walked about 20 miles, which got him far away from Paris at the time. But Paris is now a megatropolis, and this is still inside Paris. Bottom line is that he reached this point where he sat down and he died. And that's where that first church was built, where he died. And that's what Sujet and others built the existing Saint Denis Chapel. And so with that being said, any questions? You guys working on that 2-3 paragraph description? Some of you have turned them in, I know, but so I won't see you again until next week. So that means enjoy the weather while you can. I'll see you on Monday.
How about Thursday?
What?
How about Thursday?
Oh, I'm sorry, I got my things backwards. Yeah, this is the Tuesday, Thursday segment. I'll see you on Thursday. Sorry, Dad. Didn't want to get your hopes up. I had my hopes up. Oh, yeah, it's Tuesday. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I got my notes from both classes here and I'm looking. Ah. So Daniel, you saved my bacon.
Oh,
Yes, sir.
like I show up most of the time in Zoom classes,
Yeah,
and so like my roll call attendance is 65%.
yeah. Here's the thing, this has caused a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
But I do the attendance based on who's ever here in the seats. And the reason I have to do it that way is because of a couple of things. One, if somebody comes up positive for COVID and they need to do contact tracing, they need to know who was exposed to this individual. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I get a lot of people,
Emailing you.
well, no, they're not emailing me so much about, they got bowling, lacrosse,
Oh.
football, baseball, whatever it is, they got other extracurricular events. And they want us to account for them too. And so the coach is telling the university, these people are with us. I'm telling the university that person's here,
Mhm.
even if they're on Zoom, and a lot of the athletes do that. So anyway, I have to stick with this so people actually know where people really
So
are.
like at the end of the semester, my grade will be back up to like an A or so.
Yes, it will,
Okay,
because
good.
you've been here and on Zoom. That's why I asked these people
Mhm.
to please send me an email, because I don't want anybody falling through the cracks either. But I'm not really having an attendance problem per se, because I usually get people either on Zoom
And emailing.
and emailing and reminding me, because kind of going back through all of this, trying to figure out who was here by what I got on Zoom and what I get out of Canvas is just